everyone, and welcome to today's Legal Value Network webinar. I'm Alexander Yula. I'm Program Manager for LVN. A special thank you to our sponsor, Factor, for making today's webinar possible. Before we get started, I'd like to go through a few housekeeping notes. Today's session will be recorded, and we are using Zoom webinar. Therefore, attendees will be muted. We encourage you to use the question and answer feature to ask the presenters questions throughout the webinar and use the chat box feature to interact with other attendees. The opinions expressed during today's webinar are solely the panelists and do not express the views or opinions of the respective employers. Now I'd like to introduce our moderator for today's session, Executive Vice President, Global Head of Practice at Factor, John Peterson.
Thank you. So welcome to everybody, and thanks for attending today's discussion. Our topic today is ESG, which is covers a lot of territory. Why don't I first, before we get into the discussion, which we'll do in sort of a panel format, so it's not going to be an interrogation. Why don't I let each of the panelists introduce themselves? I'm a corporate finance lawyer by trade. I was a partner at Skadden and Kirkland for many years, then a managing director at Credit Suisse, and I'm now the global head of practice at Factor, where we do corporate contracting work. Dave, shall we move to you next for a little introduction?
Good afternoon, morning. Thanks, John. Dave Curran. I am the co-chair of the Sustainability and ESG Advisory Practice at Paul Weiss, as well as the executive director of the ESG and Law Institute. I have a long career both as a lawyer and as a business leader. I've come to ESG, sort of backed into it from a variety of in-house roles, including CEO, General Counsel, Chief Sustainability Officer, you name it. So very excited to have this conversation with this great group.
Thanks, Dave. Lee?
Hi, Lee Dance. I am an executive director and president, executive director of Global Counsel Leaders, which is a network of leaders in global corporate legal functions. I've run that organization for 12 years. Before that, counsel to counsel for LexisNexis. And so I've been in conversations with General Counsel throughout my career, including at Chase Manhattan Bank, which then became JP Morgan. I am really focused on ESG because General Counsel are, and many companies are right now, global companies. I work on both sides of the Atlantic, and the network does as well. I consult with also leadership teams in global corporate legal functions, and speak a couple of languages. On ESG, Global Counsel Leaders produced the first annual comprehensive report on ESG for corporate legal and compliance leaders in 2020, end of 2020, and the second one in 22. So really happy to be here today with Factor and Dave to talk about this.
Thank you, Lee. And Jessica Block.
Hi, everybody. I am Jessica Block, and I have the pleasure of working with John and many of our other bright legal minds at Factor. I myself am not a lawyer, but have made a long career, in my opinion, helping them improve their process and practice through the use of technology and other scalable process inventions, first at Arnold & Porter and then at FTI Consulting for many years, and most recently at Ankara Consulting. So I'm pleased to be here and talk about the interesting conundrum that ESG presents for folks trying to wrangle contracts and business processes around these emerging requirements.
Thanks, all of you. So our topic today, broadly, is how general counsels are tackling the challenge of increasing regulatory and stakeholder interest in ESG matters. Now, ESG is a term that's been around for 15 to 20 years. I don't know, Lee, actually, I think you know exactly how long it's been around.
Or it was named.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the term obviously covers a lot of territory. It's environmental and climate issues, social justice issues like human rights, and governance issues such as board composition, pay incentives, right? And there are so it's a lot of topics. There are a lot of cooks in the ESG kitchen too, right? There are regulators all over the world leading investment managers are interested in it, a wide range of interest groups, and they're all pushing pet priorities and favorite projects. And it's a lot for any company and for any GC to handle, particularly those who operate internationally and have to deal with countries that are moving at a different pace and sometimes creating conflicting expectations for companies. So let's open the discussion, I think, with, again, let's go back around, and I'd like each of you to talk about how you are interacting with general counsels and companies in the ESG space, and in particular, what sort of ESG issues, like of all the things, all the myriad things that fall within ESG's scope, what are the issues that are top of mind for your clients? What are they trying to adjust for? What are their main sort of challenges at this point? So why don't we start? Well, Leah, I've got you on screen. Why don't we start with you?
Okay, so the way my work in ESG is really related to educating and bringing together general counsel to talk about what they're doing. So to figure out, and chief compliance officers in some cases, to just discuss with each other how the heck do we approach this, and doing that on both sides of the Atlantic. It's not a new issue. By the end of 2019, when I was doing roundtables on both sides of the Atlantic around the world, I would ask people, what are the key things facing you? By the end of 2019, everywhere people were talking about the importance, people about their key stakeholders wanting to know more about their position on key ethical issues, environmental, things like that. Even in Italy, it was a big thing. I noticed when I was last there in October 2019, and it came up as a strong issue for us. I believe, generally, my view is that, and I speak for larger, generally global corporate organizations or international in some way, although it's hard to find a middle market company that is not sourcing or distributing somewhere else in the world. So the international goes far and wide, especially in other Western countries. And but I see ESG as a business issue. I think they view ESG as a business issue, as a governance issue, and it's been a long time now that company's brand value is partly what the company does and partly what it stands for. It's been 3 or 4 years that that's been the case, and companies have had to shift how they approach that. So it is a broad business issue with legal implications. And so I think front and center, the key issues are for GCs that I talk to are like, how do I get my arms around where I should be most actively participating? Where are the risks that I think the company's going to face? Depending on what kind of general counsel and what sector they're in, that will change dramatically. So unfortunately, there's no one size fits all. And it also depends on how ESG is being structured and developed in their company. But any kind of issue that where boards are up in arms about it, which is the case with ESG, and getting their info from everywhere, it becomes a key issue for the general counsel and the legal team. The immediate first issue, and I hope I'm not going on too long, that I see is that they're looking at disclosures and company compliance first. They're looking at liability risk, and then they're looking at the broader issues, like how can we oversee that the company keeps its promises about the way we gather and report information. And I don't think they're looking as far into certain areas that we'll talk about later in this discussion, but that probably brings it together. It's not, to me, for general counsel, they're slightly overwhelmed by the breadth of it on larger companies, but almost every head of legal in a company, with over $1 billion in revenues, will have seen how political, social, and economic trends can affect how customers, how regulators, how prosecutors, and stakeholders behave. And ESG is one of those issues. We saw it with anti-bribery in the past. We've seen it with lots of other. Look at GDPR. I see some of what's happening as an output of you can make similar context issues to GDPR, and how GDPR is kind of became something that all companies had to take on and look at broadly. I think the issue here is that it's so broad that companies need to define what their priorities are, and the general counsel too. Like, what's legal going to do about it, and what's the first 2 or 3 things?
Thanks, Lee. I sent you a note saying that we have an echo, so I don't know if there's anything you could do, but we got the benefit of your thoughts twice.
I am so sorry about that. Is it better now?
No, it's still.
I wonder if I should dial in again. Maybe I'm speaking too loud.
Okay. And in the meantime, why don't we go to Dave? Do you want to pick up on some of those topics?
Sure, and obviously Lee covered a lot of ground. ESG covers a lot of ground. I think that what I have found since starting this practice, but long before then, is that lawyers have been doing E, S, and G in different forms and contexts forever. In particular, if you look at the governance aspects of the E and the S, I mean, who else really leads in governance but lawyers, corporate secretarial function, and the like? I think what has happened is that the societal shifts for social media, the empowerment of individuals, the ability for one individual, say, to get on social media and control a dialogue is the shift, and that lawyers have been playing catch up, both inside and in the service provider space. ESG is not taught except now in one school and anywhere that I know as an actual core curriculum by a tenured professor at any law school. It's not as part of the basic training for lawyers as they enter major firms like mine. That's changing, but it hasn't been historically. You don't get an ESG primer or primer when you enter into an in-house role, yet you're addressing and dealing and wrestling with these issues every day. I look at this more as sort of governance and reputational risk, and lawyers are extraordinarily well positioned to do that, but they've been reluctant to for a variety of reasons, which we can explore in a conversation. But general counsels that I work with, hundreds of them, I'm not sure anybody has actually spoken more with general counsels than I have about ESG. Most of them don't even know that they're dealing with it when they've hit them. So I'll give you an example. I saw a poll today in Corporate Counsel magazine that said that GCs are moving away from COVID to ESG issues. Well, it's a definitional problem. When last I looked, COVID was an environmental, social, and governance disaster. It is ESG. It embodies ESG. It has permeated our society and everything that we do. Yet, if you ask the lawyer whether they've been working on ESG issues when they've been dealing with return to the office or vaccinations or in these issues, they wouldn't say that they had been. So I think it's a definitional issue for our profession. If you actually get into in terms of what the core issues are within that spectrum, to Lee's point, is a lot of especially in-house lawyers have been tagged they're it, but have been given no other training, funding, and support, because often this has been delegated and relegated to other components of an enterprise, and silos and the usual bureaucratic issues surface. And today you don't have time. The general counsel doesn't have time to wait for months for data and information. So we see them really trying to get up to speed. What are the sources of the information that they have, which many of them are not that trustworthy, to be honest, especially in the S category. And now suddenly they're catching up with themselves. The other thing I would point out, and I've written about this, but the thing that really throws lawyers off is that many of these things are not actually pure legal obligations. They're not codified. There's no place you go to say net zero, for example. It's not a legal standard, nor is racial equity, nor is gender pay equity in most places. There are exceptions, so lawyers don't, send me emails about how I missed it. But for the most part, diversity, equity, and inclusion is actually an aspiration and not a requirement. And lawyers have a hard time dealing with things that are not requirements because they think, well, then it's voluntary. Not if you say you've been doing it, it isn't. And that's the difference. So companies have been over their skis a bit on these things. They've been making statements, and now the lawyers are trying to figure out how do you substantiate to support, as Lee said, making sure what you're saying. I think I heard an enforcement person at the SEC say that you have to mean what you say and say what you say, do what you say and say what you do. And I think we'll explore this further, but I think those are the kinds of issues that General Counsel is wrestling with. What the heck is this? What am I supposed to do? What information am I supposed to rely on? How am I communicating to this? How do I deal with new kinds of antagonists and activists, litigation, investigations, government agencies outside of the US dictating what's going on in the US, because most people think the US starts these things. It hasn't. So anyway, that's a lot, but I'll leave it there.
That is a lot. We'll come back to a lot of this stuff. Jess, do you want to just give us a quick, some quick thoughts too?
Yes. So I am not an ESG expert, but we at Factor are very focused on expertise around the contracting process. And really the rubber meets the road in terms of making commitments externally and understanding as a company, your exposure to your supply chain, your commitments, your ability to enter and exit processes in your contract body. So we bring a lot of expertise to helping these poor, overwhelmed general counsels, as everybody has already made the point, reconcile all of these competing mandates, whether they be the regulatory pet projects or just different departments as they've evolved within the company that are responsible for different elements of demonstrating compliance and changing business processes to create holistic and scalable contracting processes to do more with less.
Thanks, Jess. So I've heard that ESG is sort of everything, right? That it's not taught at law school, but when you step into the door as an in-house lawyer, sort of everything you do in one way or another, or a lot of what you do one way, fits within the ESG category. But obviously the tone is changing, right? It is shifting from a non-mandated, non-regulatory environment to, I think, more so of a regulatory environment, particularly in Europe, that's ahead of the United States on mandating not only disclosure regulation, but substantive change in business processes. I don't know, Lee, Dave, do you want to talk a little bit about, is it right to say that the mix is shifting, that the voices in the room are changing and the ESG world is becoming more sort of in the classic lawyer territory of here's a 350-page SEC release and let me memorize all the footnotes, or is it still reputational and vaguer, broader, and less prescriptive?
Do you want me to take a first go, Dave?
Sure.
Either of us would have views on it. So there, in terms of their structure and reporting, European headquartered companies and UK headquartered companies are quite a bit ahead. They have to, for example, in the UK, it's required for public companies to follow the IFTC, am I getting that right? FSCR, I'm forgetting the acronym at the moment. Scheme for financial reporting, which relates to the way you measure an environmental impact. I think what's happened, I think more, the way I see the trend is that investors led the movement, the investment management world, seeing that the disasters from climate change and other impacts of climate change and also impacts of social inequity within companies in various ways would have an eventual financial impact on the company's financial performance. And so they started focusing on investing and where all the ratings and everything else comes out on those aspects. So if you look at a company like BlackRock and read, the annual letters, they are really, really much more attuned to the climate change side of things, particularly less the social, and the demands from an investment and large investors, that's getting bigger every day. So I find a direct connection between the general counsels and the company's positioning on ESG if it has BlackRock as a major investor. After and other types of investors like that. In Europe, sustainability is for much longer been a topic. It's an EC effort. I think it's a lot like GDPR, where people talked about data privacy for a long, long time. GDPR was first created as a regulation. It was a big pain in the neck for so many law firms, but they also got lots of work out of it, helping clients with it, as did many other consultancies. And then it now really is the global standard. So even if you look at California privacy laws, they've adjusted to fit. There's something now called the Brussels effect, which refers to legislation coming out of Brussels that is expanding elsewhere. And, various forms of regulation of ESG are definitely further advanced in terms of regulation in Europe than here. And by a number of years, I think the US will be quick to catch up. But at the same time as this, markets change too. So it's not just investors, it's customers, your stakeholders, your shareholders, and lots of other types of stakeholders that care about how you do what you do, and they fall into the ESG bracket. And I think that has driven companies to decide to take a position, whether or not the laws require them to do so. Why do 80% or however many of the Fortune 500 have sustainability reports? It's related to that. If you're a law firm and you're not like Dave, he's talking every day to lots of general counsel, and I'm guessing a lot of his team is, and he gets to pass that on. If you're not speaking with your clients directly and getting your lawyers into those kinds of networks of conversations about what they're doing, what are their top points, what are they trying to focus on, what are they doing with trade associations based on their sector. If you don't do that, you don't have much of a window on where you should actually be offering services or what the pain points are for your clients. And so, that would be my first recommendation. That's a little off your question, but is there anything I missed there, John?
I think that's good. And we're still getting an echo. I don't know if you've got another device.
I turned the mute on and off. I'm going to try to maybe get off and dial in again while others are talking.
Okay, thanks. So Dave, how are you seeing the onset of more prescriptive regulation? Is that affecting the agenda? Is it putting it in the sweet spot for the lawyers? What's your take?
Yeah, it's certainly impacting and affecting it. It would be hard not to, if you look at the prior administration in the U.S., where it was verboten to even mention climate, and the first act in the Biden administration was to sign back into the Paris Accords and to dictate from the president to every federal agency to factor climate into the decision-making, rulemaking, and such. I mean, that's, to pardon the phrase, a sea change, a tidal wave. I mean, even under prior administrations, this were largely these are territories that are new for the U.S. federal government. And to Lee's point, certainly Europeans have been ahead in some categories. They've not been ahead in human capital. And I think, which is upcoming in 2023, and I think it's going to be like a brick in the back of the head of lawyers when the SEC proposes rules related to human capital, diversity, equity, inclusion, and the like.
So just to be clear, so you think the Europeans have been ahead principally on the climate stuff?
Yeah, greenhouse gas emissions and the
Yep.
like. They're not further ahead in diversity, equity, and inclusion by anybody's measure. There are some rules that apply, for example, on boards, but I don't think anybody would argue that the EU or member states are further ahead in that regard. Now, and also the rulemaking process is ahead. Consequences, however, are higher here. Because as you all know, for anybody who's a lawyer or not a lawyer, anybody can go into court here in the United States and sue a company for anything, and whether they have merit or not. And that's not the case in Europe. And so, and also the potential damages. So things like derivative lawsuits are a unique creature to the US. and in particular in human capital issues, where the labor unions in the EU sit often on the boards of the companies. That's not the case here. So what ESG is unleashing is a lot of pressure, tension, conflict that has been percolating in different areas. And the media, as I mentioned earlier, social media has given voice to folks, and they're feeling emboldened and empowered. I think the biggest single difference with the attention that the Biden administration is paying, and also, for example, the SEC is enforcing in this area. They have a task force focused on greenwashing. That didn't exist, again, in the prior administrations, plural. And so with all of that, lawyers are now front and center. As we mentioned earlier, the problem is they're front and center, and sometimes they don't have any gloves on in the ring. And so they're being asked to do a lot of things, and they're trying to get up to speed on things that they really don't know much about, including thousands of pages of requirements related to greenhouse gases, scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. All of these are not fluent language for most lawyers. So what happens is there's a knee-jerk reaction. They try to latch on to things like the supposed anti-ESG movement, which I haven't seen. There's a lot of news on it, but there's really not a lot of counterweight to what's going on. And the lawyers are hoping that maybe the genies can go back in the bottle, and when in fact that's probably not likely. And so I think prudent in-house lawyers are now preparing pressure testing information. They're setting up, John, the things like when Sarbanes-Oxley came, because you're going to see an attestation process like Sarbanes-Oxley for ESG issues without a doubt. And D&O carriers are now starting to apply pressure here, because guess who foots the bill for lawsuits and activists and crisis. So all of that is a perfect storm, so to speak, in this arena. And lawyers are now trying to fathom it, what their roles are and the like, what they're supposed to do to cauterize the wounds, but also help their companies advance their business objectives.
And are the lawyers the ones raising the red flag in the company, saying this is big, this is a developing area? Or is it something that is it a board topic? Where from a corporate governance perspective, where do you see the heart and soul of this?
All roads to and from the board are the lawyers, so they control the communication process for the board. So whatever a board looks at is from the corporate secretary, and whatever comes from the board, with the exception of audit committee to CFO, is typically directed through lawyers. So no doubt, directors talk with their peers. They go to conferences, they go to dinners, and they hear about these issues. They read the media, right? It's everywhere. But I think lawyers are being pinged from everywhere. These are business initiatives. These are not random left side of the. These are, if you're going to commit to net zero, it's a massive business undertaking, sometimes costing billions of dollars depending upon your organization. If you're going to want for a diverse, equitable, and inclusive workforce, if you want to move on reducing plastics, water, et cetera, these are all major business initiatives. So they can start anywhere. I think the difference is centering them, being able to communicate them in a cohesive fashion, and being able to substantiate those communications. That's the main thing that lawyers are going to be helping with here. So the disclosure regimes are, certainly driving that. But even if you don't have to disclose, you do have to substantiate.
Right. I just to build on what Dave was saying, I could not agree more with those comments. And the general counsels are often, especially those who come from backgrounds in prosecution, which many have, are really advocates. Their great strength is advocates, advocating about government regulation and all sorts of other things. And I think many that are pretty far ahead on this are really taking that role and helping the company to do that, and also being sort of the voice that speaks up and says, should we really be considering this aspect of this particular acquisition? Will the impact of some of their supply chain problems or some of their social, behavior that's been in the news, will that come back to bite us? Just really seeing things through a sort of an ESG lens, which I think they're picking up from all these things that they're fed with throughout the organization. And so that guides them in many ways. 2 weeks ago, I was running a roundtable in November where we were talking about with a bunch of GCs on how they're considering restructuring their companies to deal with potential liability from ESG. And it was about an equal number of US and European General Counsel from, 8 countries. Not
When you say restructuring, you're talking about corporate restructuring.
Corporate
Different
restructuring. So what are some of the corporate tools you could take to try to carve out? So if your business is going to require a real change in its whole model, and you also may see huge external risks coming, like insurance industry sees, from natural disasters that create interruptions in supply chain, all that stuff. What are some ways that you can get ahead of that as it starts to come down the road? So really, looking pretty far forward. And that's a pretty new discussion, but it gives an idea, I think.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting, the recent proposed Biden administration's the supplier climate risk and resilience rule that sort of mandated certain tiers at certain levels of selling to the government were disclosing against the CDP scheme and those scores, and you can start to see the supply chain present more empirical levers and targets that can then be used by the GCs to triage their own view of their supply chain and what they need to respond to and where's a good starting point to make some of the work of acting a little bit more manageable in terms of just where to start. There's some, I think, leading indicators emerging just in terms of the schemes of what you can look to sort of understand where that known data set is going to be a significant risk indicator and more easily accessible.
So we're all one way or another service providers, I think, to companies, to GCs, right? I guess the question I have is what do GCs need? What kind of team do they need to deal with all this stuff? And again, we're still, ESG is this huge topic that encompasses all kinds of things, but what kind of support do they need? And what can we provide to help them get their head around the issues and help them to deal with some of these things? I mean, one of the things that you constantly hear from GCs is we're always being asked to do more with less. It's always more with less. There's always pressure in terms of resources, budgets, and you're also hearing, and I think Lee, you've certainly seen a lot of this, that GCs are being brought into more and more things, particularly in European companies where they may used to have been more cabined in kind of a technical legal space. People are realizing they have a lot to say about a lot of things. So they're busier, their scope of responsibilities and input is expanding. Their resources are under pressure, I guess like everybody else, but they're under pressure. They've got this wave of ESG work to do, which is like rising and maybe not falling, hard to say. What kind of help do they need? What kind of resources do they need, and who can help them? Dave, do you want to?
Yeah.
Ideas on it?
Yeah, I'll take a little bit of a contrarian view on this. I actually think in this case, more is not necessarily better. And so I think that lawyers in general, they weren't trained about ESG in law school, and they certainly weren't trained about efficient uses of data analytics and technology, as well as process management. So in our practice, for example, a third of my practice is made up of people who are not lawyers on purpose, who are specialists in program management, specialists in data and analytics technology. I know obviously Factor is a platform that is guidance around technology and the like. I think the smart general counsels are using this inflection point, I would describe as a timeout, because lawyers are trained to react and be transactional, and in the case of law firms, increasingly hyper specialized. None of those are conducive to effective risk mitigation for sure, and reputation protection in ESG. I'll give you several examples. If you're handling, for example, a discrimination case, if you're an employment lawyer, you're a hammer, and every discrimination case is a nail.
Right.
The challenge today is, and this is the ESG set of lenses, is that where there's smoke, there's fire. And if you're not addressing the systemic issues underlying that case or the 15 cases or the 100 cases, then you're just going to continue to be hammers and nails and think that a victory is getting a settlement in a case that never should have been brought. And this is an anathema for many lawyers to say, wait a second, our job isn't to do that. Our job is to help clients, if they get sued. No, I don't agree. Our job is to obviously address those things. If you get an investigation, a litigation, to do those as well as you can. But the real victory is in never having them at all. I've never seen a corporate defendant actually have a victory in either a lawsuit or an activist scenario. It's degrees of losing. So what we counsel general counsels is to have a mind shift here. This is a good time to, a friend of mine described it as predicting the present. Most companies don't even know what they're saying publicly or have said publicly on ESG issues today. They haven't done an inventory at all of what they themselves have said, not somebody else has told them to do, what they have committed to publicly. So starting there would be a good first step. The other is, because ESG is relative and not, net zero is not a Kelvin standard. Net zero is relative in a variety of ways, but certainly by industry. So, and what is equity? What is racial equity? What is gender pay equity? These are all relative terms. So the smart general counsels in their departments are using this opportunity to say, listen, we need to understand the data and analytics first. What is it telling us? What are we saying about it? How are we documenting things? What kind of governance process do we have in place to track, measure, monitor, and report on these things? If you don't do that, everything else is going to be continuing to do lawyering like it was done in the 70s, which is what law schools teach today. That's what the bar exam stresses, and it's not matching modern corporate needs. Modern corporations need people to be facile on these things. And so making sure, for example, that legal departments have access to technology, data and analytics that is leading in these spaces, that can tell them things that no documents can tell them, that no lawyers can tell them. And being open to that is really essential. And I've gone on a bit, but I think the mistake would be continuing to do the same thing and expecting different outcomes. So we'll just, put our litigators on it, or put our
Make it go away.
employment. That's definitely not working for most companies.
Right. I would add, I think the data and analytics part is huge. When reporting is such a big part of ESG, and the way that things are measured across complex companies and then integrated, many companies just don't have a clue. So there's such a huge risk of presenting conflicting data in reporting, which can really become an overnight nightmare. And so I really believe that companies that are at less risk from the impact of ESG regulation are the ones that have got their data act together, and their lawyers are really on top of how things are measured and how they come together, so they could defend. And what they can measure now, it's a huge expense. So you have to be a pretty big company to get on top of this issue. But a lot of companies are approaching it as, here's the data that we can report now with confidence. But underlying that, as Dave was saying, is something we talked about on another roundtable on ESG this fall, which was the greenwashing scare. And a lot of it's caused by marketing, because there's such a wonderful opportunity to differentiate your company based on all the great things you're doing that are green and vice versa, and socially impactful, et cetera. And in various parts of the world, if you're a global company, your people can be making promises and saying things that no one has approved anywhere. And that runs into huge problems. So the big conversation we were having was about loose lips sink ships. And can we develop kind of a lexicon for ourselves on what we mean when we talk about some of the lingo, as Dave said, which is flying around all over the place and really hard to follow in the media because so many things are defined in different ways. What's the difference between standards and frameworks? There's a million of them. So how do they divide? So there's a lot of little pieces I think you can pick off. I think for law firms, their lawyers first need to sort of understand kind of how this works, how their customers are facing these issues, large and small, and see if they can carve out certain ways they could be of help to sectors, specifically divided by sectors. But the data part, we were talking about this with Factor because I just believe there's, I heard a chief ESG officer make a presentation on to a legal department of Fortune 200 about what they're doing, and someone raised an issue as what is the impact on contracts. And the chief ESG officer said, well, we're getting a lot of contracts that are asking us to agree that we align when it's up for contract renewal. We're being asked to align with the company, our own ESG stance. And so it's contract managers that are reviewing those things. They have no idea often about what they are agreeing or accepting. And what the chief ESG officer said was those contracts that raise that, if the contract manager doesn't know what to do, it gets raised to the COO to review. So I'm thinking it's a Fortune 200 company, they're doing however many contracts a day. So it's just, this is where you see that we're at the baby steps and we really need help. And because the lawyers, general counsel can so easily be the scapegoat for this kind of situation. I think it's something that they have to get a handle on and keep on trying to provide context and priority about that risk.
I think Dave he touched on this well when he was talking about, not treating the work of closing the daylight on policy and practice as a one-time event, to make that a practice where you have experts, you have the legal team, you have the general counsel opining on what good looks like. And then you move it into more of a process-oriented set of instructions, directions, and checkpoints that folks that are not experts can respond to and look at and react to. And you have sort of a living, breathing business process that keeps that daylight gap closed and that is open for evolution as the standards change or as you receive things from the market. And I think that scaling that expertise and memorializing it in a process standard is the real evidence of why you are resilient to the different things that might come at you versus sort of being in that fighting fires mode of just reacting to a specific accusation or a shareholder proposal or what have you. It's sort of demonstrating that you can take that standard and advice and push it through a big evolved organization and think about it, think about it differently than you might have scaling traditional legal work. So, you might be in, Lee, you mentioned middle markets, you might be in middle markets legal department where it doesn't require you to think broadly, to think in a more process-oriented way about how your team of lawyers works to contract with your suppliers, because it happens once, it doesn't change. But then over the years, you end up with a very large volume of suppliers. And if you need to go through that set of contracts to react to the changing regulatory environment or a change in your own policy stance or otherwise, that's when you need the scale. That's when you have to have that process muscle developed so that you're not caught using, a non-scalable business process working like you've always worked to respond to a challenge. And that's sort of the resilience of the organization there with respect to the contracts, at least.
I love that point, Jess. It's spot on. This is all about process. It's not just contracts. And lawyers are not process engineers. And so a lot of the resistance of lawyers isn't because they're not smart enough to do it. It's just not in their wheelhouse in terms of how they come to the office virtually or in reality every day. And this is about process. So I was talking to a general counsel who said, we're not going to be taking a position on the abortion issue, for example. We're not making a statement. And I said, by not making a statement, you're making a statement. That's the era we're in. In fact, your employees will be asking you questions about it, one way or the other, wherever you come out on it. So you're making a statement. It's a benefit. Often with companies are going to ask benefit questions. You're going to be making a lot of statements, whether you want to make a statement or not. What's your process at the management level and at the board level, to John's point earlier, for addressing these things? You have to have a center court, like if you think of a tennis kind of thing. You have to think about where you're going to be to return the serve rather than the specific issue. And most lawyers think, if I'm a general counsel and I grew up as a litigator, I think of litigation. If I'm a general counsel, I grew up as a corporate lawyer, I think of corporate issues. And when in fact, you really need to look at this as a process thing and saying, we need to know how we're going to address these issues, in what process fashion, who's going to be involved around the table. So the biggest issue to me is the interrelationships and the silos within organizations. People have heard me say this in my own programs with the ESG and Law Institute. I'm an expert in corporate dysfunction, not in ESG. And it's corporate dysfunction that creates crises in most cases. They're self-imposed. Mishandling of information, saying the wrong things, not clearing things with people. And the difference today is you don't have the time, and you've got lots of people really scrutinizing what you're doing. They're looking at your process. They're saying, by the way, you have these contracts with these parties. Did you know you had contracts with these parties? And these companies are so big that the lawyers didn't even know that they were doing business here, or that they had employees doing X or contractors doing Y. So I think a big part of it is understanding this process flow, and lawyers desperately need to bring in people that are not lawyers, understand critical control point analysis and where things go badly.
Can I?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No,
Lee.
go ahead.
I was just going to throw in there on two things, with respect to corporate dysfunction and data, my two favorite things. I think, it is almost 2023, and it is a very scary reality that people do not understand, where their contracts are, what is in their contracts, despite the profusion of technology and folks like us that are desperate to help you do that. I mean, it is just not risen to a level of priority in some instances, or it's bubbled up as a priority and then fractured into a million tiny pieces as different sort of business and procurement and legal take their own stab at it. I think the data can almost become a liability in that way too. So was talking to a procurement officer at a global bank the other day, and he was describing his team's efforts to incorporate that data into their buying process. And, presumably the business is already evaluating it vis-a-vis the loan portfolio and other things and emerging regulations in Europe. But, he's got many, many different data sets at his disposal, and he's already bought some, and he's paid a lot of money for different ones that sort of come with a regulatory package. And there's other ones that seem to be like more relevant and to the purpose. And so he's sort of overwhelmed to the point of inaction on using the data. He's got too much of it. And so that's sort of creating a risk for him because he's acting differently than another piece of the company against similar mandates. So I think a lot of this work is just doing the best you can to help people think holistically about the way that they're responding to all of these very similar mandates.
Yeah, and more is not better in this case. There's a lot of data in ESG. Much of it isn't very trustworthy or useful. And that's the problem. Lawyers don't have these teams, to John's point, they don't have these massive teams with big budgets to sort through. So they are very reliant and codependent on other people, internal and external. And I just wanted to add that in the ESG space, there's also a myriad of external data providers and tech companies, some of whom have overpromised and underdelivered for years. And these companies are relying on this information, but it's not audit worthy. It is not at the level of their finance information. And I remember talking with the general counsel a couple of years ago, and I said, by the way, SASB is not FASB. And a lot of lawyers didn't understand the distinction, that they thought that the rigor that went into the information that they get, for example, on climate is the same as they get for their financials. And that is not the case in many situations.
Right, we're just not able to. It seems to me that there's sort of two levels. So the general counsel is often trying to help manage what the priorities are for the company based on what they've chosen, and oversee some of the trends working up and down, which is what the role they so often are in. The challenge right now is that many of them are not, as Dave said, not good process managers. So unless they have someone else running that function for them within the law department, and you see more and more of our members, I'm seeing them have there's a steadily growing number of people that are not legally trained in the department that makes up the percentage. For those reasons, they're operations people, tech people, all oriented towards process people and tech. That relates to legal. That's the minority though. So if there needs to be places in the organization where that can be found, and chief ESG officers are dying for it. But so what you get is these issues that are kind of like how you set up a compliance structure through process. I think people know that it needs to be done. It's hard to get their arms around it right now, and that'll continue to be a challenge. And just sharing some best practices will be useful for law firms that are trying to sell services. Some of what types of things are working or how they work, I think will be useful, and for GCs to talk with each other about those things. I was just trying to think of another point I had about that. Also about being connected, at the hip. GCs are more and more connected at the hip of their corporate communications team, which is going to be so essential in this kind of a debate where ethics are so important. AIG, Lucy Fato was saying earlier this year, GCs, CEOs get asked the kind of questions like Dave was saying that they never would have been asked in the past to take a position on things. And the legal person is often, they have a whole team of people that gets together to decide, 3 or 4 or 5 people that regularly meet to say, okay, what's the right position we're going to take on that? And then what's in the background that's going to allow us to report effectively that what that person says we're following through on, so that you don't show contradictions. I think the big challenge again, and it pushes towards technology, is that in the early days of the pandemic, we were doing a lot of roundtables and asking people what they were dealing with. And I asked for two people in a row said, I've been asked in the last week, who's legally okay to take people's temperatures as they come into the office during the pandemic. And
I thought you were going to say force majeure, but that's a
no,
much better example.
That on contracts and stuff. And so I asked for a show of hands, and like 80% of the people had been asked, like, is it okay to have our receptionist taking people's temperatures or whatever out there with what's the legal rules? They now are being called in this unstable world, called in on for all kinds of things. And I think what I just keep on saying to them is find your priorities. And right now what's hard is the quick answer questions are coming fast and forward, and they are service providers too. And so it's hard for them to be working on, without the expertise to know how to do it, the process piece. And I think many of the best, giving people a case to be able to sell that to their executives, that support is something a law firm can really do value to their, and any consultancy, to give people their script, really, to be able to sell technology. Most general counsel are really lousy at it, or sell the process piece.
Yeah, and I think it's like the general is easy to abstract in some ways. Like Lee, you mentioned GDPR and privacy. We've done a lot of work with different financial regulations. I mean, in all of these cases, you're using something, whether it's data, whether it's the size of the contract, whether it's sort of visibility or location. I mean, you're ranking what you're going to go after first. This is the first tier. This is the second tier. Like, there's always a risk balance of impact and risk mitigation and financial impact. And I think a lot of people are also doing this right now with respect to, just with the economic tightening, looking at suppliers and ability to terminate and resiliency there. Like those tactics and techniques are the same no matter the underlying issues. It's just sort of a way of organizing and enabling your organization to act against a lot of confusion and complexity.
Yeah, and I would add, I know we're coming up on time, John. I would underscore for the audience and for anybody who talks to them, this is urgent for lawyers to get better educated. This is not an option. This is not somebody else's issue, because if you're making decisions, the reason that I describe myself as leaving law firm retirement after 30 years to come back into a law firm wasn't because I missed terribly being in a law firm. It's because if your principal outside counselors don't know anything about what the TCFD is, or what UNPRI is, or what greenhouse gas emissions are, or what human capital requirements are, the advice they're going to give when they're the last person in the room with the general counsel and the board is going to be flawed advice. And it's not going to be complete and comprehensive. And so my advice to all lawyers is learn as much as you possibly can, even if it's not in a law school class nicely teed up for you.
Well, this was the question.
Yeah.
Why did you then decide to go to law firm and not start the first ESG program at a law school?
Well, we're doing both. So our ESG Law Institute is working with, we have 7 universities now, and we're pushing those universities to have core curriculum. So if you look at Lisa Fairfax at University of Pennsylvania, she now has the first course at a law school by a tenured professor in a day course, not an adjunct. And we're hoping that this spreads like anything, because law schools are so far behind. And they've been fighting it. Tenured professors fight it. They don't think they think it's woke, whatever their explanation is, and they're wrong. They are doing a disservice to our community by not teaching in this area. And frankly, law schools don't require corporations law as a requirement at law schools. You don't have to, you can go through 3 years of law school and not take corporations law, which I think is also absurd.
Yeah. So it's a question of learning the law, learning the subject matter, and bringing to bear process expertise and the right range of experts, so you've got the right data and you can implement the programs that you need to implement. Sounds very broad. Okay, we're down to the last minute.
That's all you have to do.
That's all you got to do. It's easy. It's just you buy it. It's all
done.
And keep track of the acronyms, of course.
Right. So Lee, Jess, we're down to sort of the last couple of minutes here. Do you have any thoughts on 2023, what it's going to look like in the ESG space, what lawyers should be focusing on right now?
Messy. I think that we just have to sort of say it's going to be really messy. Just keep on sort of thinking about close to home issues, what you can take on now and actually handle, and just push out the noise and just get everybody to calm down about all that noise if you can. Lawyers are great about calming people down. That's important. It'll take a while before the dust settles on ESG. It's an inflection point, as Dave said. So good time to sit back and think about it.
Thank you, Lee.
Yeah, my vote is supply chain. I mean, I think there's a McKinsey study saying at least 2/3 of your footprint is in your supply chain. I think that's going to be true, and it's so close to home right now with inflation and just everything we've experienced during COVID and post-COVID. So getting control of that visibility, understanding your portfolio of relationships, and making yourself nimble and acting against those.
And fixing your contracts.
Yes, obviously.
That's
what I mean. That's what's in it for us.
And Dave is saying you should go back to law school, except there isn't any place to go back to.
All truth is in footnotes.
That's exactly
what I learned in law school.
That's right. Okay. Well, listen, thank you, everybody. I think we have hit our allotted time. So I'd like to thank the panelists. This was an entertaining discussion. Obviously there's a lot we could have talked about, but we covered the main topics. I'd like to thank the attendees for coming, and thank the Legal Value Network for organizing this. So
thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, y'all. Good luck.